Greetings, students. Michael Sabirian here, and this is our third lecture on World War I. And specifically, I want to talk to you about the socioeconomic impacts of the war. World War I is a major demographic overhaul in the United States. I'm going to get to the PowerPoint in just a moment. Let me do the share screen, screen number 2, share, and boom. Okay, so first of all, the war massively mobilizes the American people. Economically, you have the conscript army, which takes a lot of people out of the workforce. Now, one of the things that's really awkward and nobody fully appreciates, one of the things that you've got going on is the merging of a number of different technologies. So, first, you have the registration process for the draft. So you literally have every governmental office going down to the county level, everything from the county judge to the postmaster to county clerks being conscripted to this national effort to register the adult male population for the draft. Well, you don't have a national bureaucracy yet. In many ways, the selective service system is your first national bureaucracy. And so when you're making a national bureaucracy from scratch, you have to base it on the existing bureaucratic infrastructure. And so one of the things I had pointed out, and this is really important, not just to me because I'm your professor, although it is important to me because it's what I did my graduate research on, is that the draft in 1917, the original World War I draft, drafted people from the age of 21 to 31. There was a reason why they drafted 21-year-olds and not 18-year-olds. And that was because the roster that they first used to do the draft were the voting rolls. And voting age in the United States was 21, male. So you start with your voting rolls to know who you need to hit up to draft because you don't have other bureaucracies. So nowadays, if you register for selective service, you're already pretty well plugged into the American bureaucracy because when you're born, you have a birth certificate. When you turn 16, you have a driver's license. When you go to school, you have the creation of myriad school records. When you matriculated to the Alamo colleges, you provided all of these proofs of identity, you linked the bureaucracy, and now you have a student ID, you have a student number, you're in a database. None of those technologies exist in 1917. You don't have a social security system yet. There is no national identification number there's no national identification numbering system yet. So you have to base your conscript system on the one existing bureaucracy that every state maintained, which was voter rolls. Okay, so who's voting? Women aren't voting yet. Men are voting. And in the American South, Black men are not voting, so typically they're not on the voter rolls. And so if you look at your conscript army is white, urban, and actually tends to be more literate and more educated because people of the lower socioeconomic status, especially when poverty results in malnutrition, which results in disqualification from military service because of nutritional deficiencies, they tended to be better educated and better fed than say in World War II or Civil War in Vietnam. The other thing is when you talk about that changes the shape of the units, and I'm going to get into this in just a moment. So you have a race problem, especially where, okay, one of the things that we don't fully understand is groups of people that we typically considered in the block of white. White as a social construction is not fully iterated. In other words, Anglo-Saxon stock Americans did not typically consider Italians to be white. They didn't consider Southern Europeans to be white. They didn't consider Eastern Europeans to be white. They thought of them as other. And the other thing is once you start conscripting people, then you have to start giving them jobs. So you have the administration of IQ tests to these military recruits. And so one of the things that you actually have, because in 1917 you don't have computers, but you have punch cards, is you have the beginnings of IQ testing and massive conscription of males of society. And this is where you start having IQ tests being administered writ large. This is later going to pave the way for other intelligence quotient tests, such as the SATs come out in the 1920s. But anyway, you have these tests, which are largely tests of language and reasoning, being administered to the new conscripts, which includes people of various ethnicities, Italian in these cities, Italians, Jews, Greeks, Turks, etc. But then you also have eugenics, which is still the popular thing. Remember, we don't have this idea of humans being the same under a microscope until the 1950s. We don't have DNA until the 1950s. And so you have these study of bone structure, you have these IQ tests, you have all of these things that fuel this sort of anti-immigrant sentiment and fuels the science of eugenics. Now, hold on to this, because in the 1920s, you have eugenics. That's the 1920s. Desegregation comes 30 years later, and then your integration goes 1950s, 1960s into the 1970s. I want you to keep these dates and these thought processes in mind. So, moving on. You have Americanization. You have the Germans being portrayed as brutes. This almost looks almost King Kong, and this is Lady Liberty. And so it seems as a matter of chivalry to protect the damsel in distress from the mad beast. But you have crusades that fundamentally removed German, which had been a second language in much of the United States, from popular society. And so the melting pot gives way to a unified American national identity. You even have so one of the things that you run into is as men are moved into deployment, this then creates the need for more labor. And so you have growth of Mexican-American populations in the West, not only to fill labor needs that aren't being filled because men are being drafted, but also because Mexico, as I had stated previously, had been destabilized following the end of the Porfiriato. In 1907, you have the Gentleman's Agreement that ended Japanese migration. And in 1913, California prohibited Asians from owning or leasing land. You do have Filipinos enlisting in the American Army, as the Philippines is a territory of the United States. But one of the things that you have going on, again, when they talk about these when they talk about specifically the Filipinos and African Americans serving in military units, they're not serving in the conscript units. They're serving in professional military units. So again, when you read about in the text, African Americans and Native Americans serving in these ethnically diverse units, they're serving in the war, but they're not serving in the draft army. They are joining, or sometimes they were in the military prior to, they were in the regular army. So one of the things that comes up, and I don't have a good way of communicating this, when you look at service in World War I, you had people served in 4 different manifestations. You could categorize them as, you had the National Army, which was the conscript army. Those were the people who registered for selective service and were called up. You had the regular army. These were people who enlisted in the army before the war even broke out. You had the National Guard, which, again, some people joined the National Guard after the registration date, but a fair number of people, again, they were in the National Guard prior to. These were people who had done that. And then, of course, you had people who were in the Navy and the Marine Corps. These are, again, all volunteer units. There's another group of people who saw American citizens who saw action in World War I. So many people who were of British and French descent who wanted to fight in the war, even though America wasn't in the war, they and this is kind of a reverse of the stereotype of the person going to Canada to avoid military service. So in the Vietnam War, if a person wanted to evade the draft, one would go to Canada, which Canada was not in the Vietnam War. But see, in World War I, Canada is a British possession. So what some people would do if they wanted to get in the fight and they were Americans, what they would do is they would go to Canada. Canada is part of the British Empire and would then join with a British unit in Canada. Now, one of the consequences of those people who took up arms against the Germans by enlisting in British military units is they lost their citizenship because they had taken up arms in a foreign army. And many of those people had, joined the British in 1914, 1915, 1916 before the Americans declare war in 1917. So again, here you have a Native American corporal, but he had joined a regular army unit. He was not conscripted because Native Americans don't vote. Same with people joining African American units. Those African American military units, those are the same segregated units that had been in the American Army, some of them going back to the Civil War, some of them in fighting the Native Americans. And one of the things that Wilson, who is a Southern Democrat, he reinstitutes a number of racist policies. One of the things that was actually kind of interesting, because, you have a highly bureaucratic state, you have names on a paper. Well, one of the things that he did was he required photographs for certain federal positions to make sure, one, it becomes a class barrier, but two, to see what the candidate looks like. And, some college admissions required photos for admission up and until the 1970s and 1980s, where it was presumed to be racist. What's actually kind of funny is now some colleges are bringing photographs back. But anyway, so here we have Liberty leaving some people of color out to hang in this political cartoon. One of the things that you have going on in addition to that, again, Wilson's views on people of color would not be considered progressive by any stretch of the imagination. And one of the first great silent films to come out is D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation, which basically gives rise to this unified vision of the Ku Klux Klan. So one of the things that you have emerging in the 1920s is you have the Klan has two major iterations. The first iteration of the Ku Klux Klan is in the American South during the Union occupation. It's a resistance movement, and it helps bring the Democratic Party to power in the American South after the Union Army leaves. But then the second iteration of the Klan is in Gary, Indiana, and some of this is in response to the new migration out of Eastern Europe, but also the migration of African Americans to cities. So with a large number of men being conscripted from the cities, going into military service, this creates job opportunities for African Americans to leave the sharecropping existence. And so you have whole families from places like Georgia and South Carolina moving into the neighborhoods of cities like Chicago and New York. So Chicago South Side, Harlem. And so this is the urbanization of the African American experience. Once you begin to urbanize and you're not spread out in these disparate rural communities, you begin to have the creation of a more unified Black culture. You have the ability to protest. You have these African Americans, whole communities where you have middle class opportunities to service the needs of the workforce. Again, your first tier employment is in the factories, which, by the way, they're being paid less, but they are being paid cash. Whereas, again, if you're a sharecropper, you're not being paid cash. Well, you have, as these novel African-American populations are moving into the cities, they're facing lower wages, but they're also driving up the rents, because anytime anybody new shows up, that happens. There is a drive to ameliorate their social station. And one of these was led by W.E.B. Du Bois, who was the first African-American to get a PhD in the United States. He actually gets his PhD in sociology. He has socialist and Marxist tendencies. Now, one of the things that he does in cooperation with several prominent progressives is to create the National Association of Colored People, the NAACP. And that is an organization devoted to protestation to ameliorate the plight of the African American. Again, one of the things that the textbook points out is military service was seen as a justification, or again, you have a large number of African Americans experiencing military service. That's not as military service participation. Again, they didn't participate in the draft army, they participated in existing units. You don't have the same level of participation in the military service in World War I the way you did in World War II. World War II is really the one where you have large-scale African-American participation in the war, and that forms the nucleus of the civil rights movement and desegregation. World War I, the numbers are not quite there, so that's coming. This is really where you have mass migration to the cities, you have the beginnings of a collective protest, and you have, yes, the beginnings of the NAACP, but it really doesn't come to full fruition until after World War II. The other thing you have going on beyond the ceaseless agitation of W.E.B. Du Bois is you have this rise of a type of Africa. So here's the Niagara folks, the Niagara movement, who begin the NAACP. You also have racial violence in the cities as new people show up, competing for jobs, driving up the cost of rent. And one of the responses is protestation for equality. The other idea is Garveyism. Garveyism was a type of African-American nationalism, and this idea of self-segregating, creating an African-American community that takes care of itself, and even this idea of African-American repatriation or a back to Africa movement. Now, there have been a number of migrations of African-Americans to Africa in Liberia. So you had one in the era of James Monroe, you have one shortly after the Civil War, and then you have another one in the 1920s. Garvey himself is Jamaican. He's anti-colonial. He sees even the structure of the African Americans living in the cities as a type of colonialism. And so his thought process was to create these self-contained African American communities and eventually migration back to Africa. And that the African colonial possessions, such as Jamaica, I mean, Haiti had already had its independence, but many of the Caribbean islands should be independent from imperial control. Garvey will eventually be convicted of mail fraud and deported. And, you know, there are varying ideas of how much of that was trumped up. So here you have the statistics of the Black population in the census of 1910. Let's see if I can get the pointer on this. Here, laser pointer. So here, New York, it increases by 40,000. Here it increased, Philadelphia 50,000, Chicago 60,000, St. Louis not so much, 20,000, Detroit. Now the percent increases, you know, multiplication. Pittsburgh 12,000, Cleveland 26,000. So this is substantial. This is a substantial depopulation of substantial influx of humans. And again, it's spurred by economic opportunities during the war as people, as white men in the cities are conscripted for the war. Now, in addition to that, here you have the 1921 Tulsa Massacre. This is a little out of sort. So one of the things that happens after the war, because remember, the Americans are only in the war from 1917 to 1919. Really, it's only 2 fighting seasons. It's the spring of, well, not even 2 fighting seasons. It's really because your first round. So registration is June of 1917. The first draftees get called up in September of 1917. That group is deployed. Fighting season, let's just say January, February of 1918. September of 1918, they do a second draft call. November of 1918 is the armistice, and then of course the peace treaty is in 1919. So by 1919, and I'm going to come back to this. Here you have the Tulsa massacre. Tulsa is a thriving Black community that was reduced to ashes. It was the term was Black Wall Street. Here's Marcus Garvey. Again, he's the leader of an African-American nationalist movement who would eventually be deported for mail fraud. Here's why 1919 is important. Okay, so war ends. Your conscript army comes back. Your conscript army comes back with no real financial support for the veterans. So they're coming back to wage controls, price controls. Oh, by the way, someone else took your job. Okay, for those of you who are in the service currently, nowadays, the employer can't give your job away just because you're deployed. Those protections were not there. So many of them come back to higher rents and no job. Not a great way to win friends and influence people. So one of the things that happens is you have a number of race riots that occur, and you have an economic readjustment as your troops are demobilized, they return to the workforce, wages go down, prices go up, things become expensive. Oh, by the way, when the economy becomes destabilized, all of a sudden, radical political ideologies like communism start to make a lot of noise and start to look really appealing to people who work hard and have just found themselves in poverty. By the way, communism is scary to the powers that be, having seen the Russian Revolution topple the Tsar's government and eventually will kill the monarch. Rather gruesomely. Then you have the purges and all the other terrible things as the Russian Revolution consolidates itself. Oh, and to add insult to injury, there's a major flu pandemic that goes from 1918 to 1919 that kills more than twice the number of people as the war. And so you have steel strike, you have industries on strike, you have race riots, you have a general reconsolidation of the American workforce, and it's a post-war economic hiccup, which part of that creates a fear of communist subversion in the United States, which one of the consequences of that has been the creation of the FBI. So the Federal Bureau of Investigation is birthed to monitor and track communists. Now, the armistice is declared. Wilson sails off to go negotiate the treaty. He comes back with the treaty and his 14 points. Now he has to get the treaty ratified. And there are some problems with the Treaty of Versailles. One of the major problems with the Treaty of Versailles, because Americans could care less about, okay, Americans wanted freedom of the seas, and oh, wait. Okay. I kind of want to go to the 14 points, but I'm going to give you the broad stroke. The basic idea behind the Treaty of Versailles and Wilson's 14 points was freedom of the seas, free trade, self-determination for the colonial peoples, and the establishment of a League of Nations to adjudicate disputes between nations. That was the sticking point. Because while the Europeans kind of wanted a League of Nations, the Americans were not keen on sacrificing American sovereignty to an international body. Again, this goes back to America's fear of foreign entanglement. So here's our map before and after, which we had talked about in the previous lecture. This is going to lay the groundwork for World War II. The breakup of the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East is going to pave the way for a lot of conflicts in the Middle East that are still haunting us today. So thanks, Woodrow. But the key thing was the treaty debate. Again, after World War I, plenty of Americans were just as soon ready to let, the Europeans and the rest of the world go to hell, for lack of a better word. Many Americans after the war embraced a type of isolationism. There was no stomach after a very expensive, very costly, and what was seen as kind of a futile war to have the United States pledged and involved to a capricious and arbitrary League of Nations that could impose itself on American sovereignty. And so there was a massive treaty debate. Wilson goes on a whistle-stop tour all throughout the United States. He suffers a stroke trying to get the treaty ratified. And after all of this, yes, the war is over, but America retreats into a desire to return to normalcy. So Warren Harding will be elected president in 1920. And one of the things that Harding gets to do, and this paves the way for the Roaring Twenties, he reduces the tax rate, he reduces the foreign involvement. The American economy has stabilized with the new influx of, after getting through that post-war readjustment, and this paves the way for a period of economic prosperity that will last nearly a decade. And so here's Gandhi. Again, Gandhi will cut his teeth, and this will pave the way for India's independence from Britain, although that won't occur until after World War II. And here is a political cartoon where the Senate refusing to ratify the Treaty of Versailles, the Senate opponents are busting through as Uncle Sam is about to be wed to foreign entanglements. And here, right here, you have that's the pencil. Right here, you have a caricature of Woodrow Wilson as the priest to this wedding. And so again, America retreats from the world, but does so to a period of economic prosperity led largely by reduction in taxes and reduction in arms commitments abroad. And so we'll explore that in the next unit as we explore the rise of the Roaring Twenties and the Great Depression. Thank you.